Hello and welcome back to Chapter 3 of Unit 1, Business and the Constitution. We have went over the federal state powers and the Supremacy Clause. And so now we're going to go over the checks of government power, and then we'll talk about the Commerce Clause and the Takings Clause. What does independent checks mean? What it does is what limits our government from just doing whatever they want, whenever they want. And there's three main independent checks on their power. And those are the freedom of speech, the due process clause, and our equal protection clause. These are what really, when it comes down to it, limits the government the most in taking away our freedoms. So the first is freedom of speech. And what we have to remember is freedom, when we're talking about speech, we're talking about speech. It may be written, it may be spoken, but it's speech, it's not conduct. However, we do have speech, or we do have the right to associate or to not associate that is protected under freedom of speech because that's a form of expression. So we're talking expression, okay? We Our freedom of speech, just like everything else, is not limitless. We cannot. There's certain speech that we're limited to doing. Right? We can't incite violence. We could be sued civilly for defamation, and it's a law, right? So the government has passed it. Remember, every time we're talking about our freedoms, we're talking about the government taking them away. And if they pass legislation that says, "Hey, wait a second, you you are able to, sue someone for saying what they want," that could possibly limit our speech. So defamation suits are limited and they have certain criteria, okay? And we're going to learn about all that. So freedom of speech, it encourages citizens to be able to talk about their government without ramifications. And people can say things that may not be nice and we may not like, but at the end of the day, we have a freedom to speak. There are other ways that we can protest people instead of throwing them in jail or file lawsuits. For example, if you do not like somebody's business model because maybe they discriminate, then you just don't go to the business, right? So we have this freedom so that we can express not only the government without our ramifications, but others. But it doesn't ban private citizens from restricting other private citizens from certain speech. For example, we have trade secrets where if you have a trade secret and it's disclosed, then you could possibly, that person, you could sue them for that. We also have loyalty, where we can require by contract that our employees are loyal to us. This is all within the realm of freedom of the speech. Private parties are allowed to respond to speech, right? But remember, not all speech is protected. False speech, fighting words, some commercial speech, and some public accommodation laws too. Okay, so let's talk about those. Types of speech. If we talk about political or non-commercial speech, which is literary or artistic, okay, so we're talking about in news, right? These laws, if you're going to regulate that speech, we're talking about regulate, not take away, the law has to fulfill a compelling government interest because that's the highest protection we have, is the ability to speak politically and literally or artistically, okay? Non-misleading and about lawful activity speech, the government, if it's so basically, if it's not political and it's commercial, but it's non-misleading, then the government has substantial underlying interest. They can, and they narrowly tailor regulations, they can tailor that sort of speech. Obviously, if it's commercial and it's misleading or about an unlawful activity, that's always going to be constitutional, meaning the government can do whatever it wants. Any legislation, the requirement for the statute to be constitution is that it's always constitutional because we don't have a protection for commercial speech that's misleading or about unlawful activity. So what you want to remember is political and non-commercial speech, it's the highest burden for the government to prove that a statute's constitutional, okay? Because we don't want them limiting that. If it's non-misleading about lawful activity, the government has to prove that they have the substantial underlying interest, and the law directly advances that interest and is narrowly tailored to fulfill that. And if they can prove those things, then that statute is going to be found constitutional. And if it's a commercial, misleading, or about unlawful activity, they have the right to regulate that as much as they want. Those statutes are always going to be constitutional. So let's talk about public accommodation. There guarantees that every person the full and equal employment of public accommodation without unjust discrimination, okay? And then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans Disability Act, prohibit discrimination by places of public accommodation on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or disability. And all but 5 states have very, very similar statutes, okay? Public accommodation laws generally will trump freedom of speech, meaning someone's right to not be discriminated is going to trump freedom of speech. But as you'll see in the case of Creative LLC and in the Boy Scouts, there is this interesting little dynamic between the two, right? Because freedom of speech is also freedom to not have speech a certain way or do a certain thing. And it's a certain balancing act the courts have been doing. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Creative LLC after your second part of your brief. The next thing is due process, and we've talked about that, right? The Fifth Amendment, so the federal government had to could not deprive us of due process. And then the 14th Amendment said states you can't either. And we have procedural and we have substantive. And basically what that means is it can't take away some of the fundamental rights that we have, even if they're not necessarily in our first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. They have to be, if they're fundamental rights, we cannot be deprived without due process. Substantive is they cannot violate the freedoms guaranteed in our Constitution, right? Procedural due process is things like they have to give us notice, they have to give us a fair trial or hearing, right? Equal protection is the last thing that helps to puts checks on the power of federal or the government. And that is if a statute or a government act, we're always talking about the government, classifies or distinguishes a group of people, okay, it's the same type of people and distinguishes it from other people, and they make this distinction, and it's going to benefit or burden some but not the other, that's going to violate the Equal Protection Clause. So equal protection is everybody has equal protection, okay, so let's think about it that way. And so the government cannot pass laws that, even if they have the effect, maybe not the intent of the law, but they have the effect of benefiting or burden a certain group over others, it's going to be unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause. So we have the Equal Protection Clause, we have due process, and we have freedom of speech. And these are the checks that we all have. This is what we can check the government on from passing legislation that's way out there. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the Commerce Clause, and that's one of the powers that Congress is given under the Constitution. And we're going to take a look at how they regulate commerce.